So we're going to start by cleaning out all the threads on the block that are important for either sealing or for the oil galley plug. So anything that's going to seal oil or going to torque down something, so like the head bolts, we're going to want to chase out all those threads. That way it gives you an even torque. So for these oil galley plugs on the back here, this is what they look like. You want to make sure that the threads in there are perfect so that they seal right. These are already very clean from the machine shop, but I just want to make sure that they run down really, really smooth to make sure that there's nothing in the holes. You want to make sure that all of the crud and rust or any debris is cleaned out of these threads to ensure that the oil galley plugs seal properly. And then we're going to blow them out with air. Now we know that that's nice and cleaned out. Now the oil galley plugs on the front of the block don't need to seal as much as the ones in the back, because if they leak out of the front, they're just going to be leaking into the timing cover and back down into the pan. So you really don't need to put sealant on these. They're just plugs to keep the oil pressure up, because the oil that's pumping through there, if it leaks out, if there's like a major leak, then you're going to lose oil pressure. So these caps are super important that they don't have holes in them or that they don't leak. But if they do seep out a little bit, it's not a huge deal. Some people like to upgrade these plugs and they'll actually tap out these holes and thread them, and then they'll get more of the threaded ones to put in the front. But I honestly think that it's unnecessary, and you can just use the ones that come in your kit. Basically all you do is just set it in there, and then we're just going to punch it in with a hammer and a small socket. These two holes on the sides are 9/16, and then the one in the middle is this EPC 108. They're stamped in the middle of them. So you just set your plug in there and get a socket that fits in the back of it. You're going to need a metal hammer to tap it in there all the way. And then just go ahead and drive it in. You want to stop when the plug gets about right there, because if you drill it in any further than that, you're going to block off an oil hole. If you can see down in that middle one, there's a little oil passage down there. And if you block off that hole, then you're not going to get oil to your cam bearings, and then you're going to starve the engine of oil. Now, if you could see that in the video, a lot of the coating came off of the plug as I was hammering it in. So you want to make sure that you blow the block off with some air. And then it's possible that that coating got on the inside of the oil galley as well. So you want to go in through these lifter holes and make sure that you clean out all of those as well. When you put in your core plugs, if you're installing these yourself, make sure you use some kind of sealant around the outside of them. First of all, make sure they're super clean, make sure they're dry, and then put some pipe sealant or some RTV, gasket maker, something of that sort to put them in. And then you can just use a socket, just like we did with the front oil galley plugs, and then just go ahead and drive those in with a hammer too. But before you put these ones in, I recommend painting the block first if you're going to. That way when you put the core plugs in, they look nice and they're clean, and it doesn't look like you just painted over the old ones. You can actually tell that the block was cleaned and machined, and then the core plugs are redone. But for me, since mine are already installed, I'm just going to have to mask them off, or maybe I'll just clean them out after I'm done painting them. That way it just looks like a nice finish when you're done. Once you have your oil galley plugs installed, we can go ahead and get it back up onto the engine stand. That way the engine stand won't be in the way of us trying to put those galley plugs in. And then we can start cleaning the rest of the block so we can get the rest of the parts put in. Just a little tech tip, the closer you can get the center of this engine stand to the center of the block where the cam is, the easier the block is going to be to rotate on the stand. Now that you have it up on the stand, it's a great time for us to paint the block. That way we keep it from rusting or anything like that. Just everything that's on the exterior that sees all the weather. You're just going to want to start by masking off all the surfaces where there's going to be gaskets. And then we'll just stick the oil pan on the bottom of the block, and then we'll be totally good to just start spraying this thing. So this was supposed to be a bright red, nice cherry red looking like that. And it's orange. Before we start cleaning the block, it's a good idea to go and tap out all of these holes where the head bolts go. The reason why is because when LT1 heads go on, you actually have to put RTV sealant on all the bolts, because if you look into this hole, it's actually a passageway for the coolant to get in. And so there has to be thread sealant on all of the head bolts. So when the head bolts previously came out, they likely all had RTV gasket on them, and if you don't clean off all that gasket and all of that RTV, then when you try to put the bolts back in, if some of them have more RTV on them than others, they're just not going to run in smooth, and they're not going to torque evenly. The best thing you can do is just clean as you go. That way you just keep everything as clean as possible. And then we'll do a final clean in just a minute here, and then we can start reassembling the block. Once you start cleaning the block, it's best to get everything reassembled as soon as possible. That way it doesn't have time to collect dust and just sit there and for dirt to get into the cylinders and fill in all the holes that you just cleaned off. So if you're not going to be putting everything back together right away, then I recommend waiting till a time that you have a little bit more time. I'm going to bag this up for the night. Anytime you're done working on an engine, you should always keep it clean and keep it covered. I have my crankshaft and pistons and everything over here on the table in garbage bags too, just to keep it from collecting dust if there's stuff settling in the air. So I'm going to wrap this thing up for the night, and tomorrow we'll get cleaning this thing and start reassembling. We're going to start deep cleaning the block to get it ready for the crankshaft installation. You should get some of these lint-free rags. Basically all it is just cloth from a t-shirt. So technically you could just find some old t-shirts and rip them up and turn them into towels. But I just bought these from Home Depot. The reason why you clean everything very thoroughly from the machine shop is because even at the machine shop, there is so much dirt and debris and stuff that gets everywhere. Even transporting it in your car, bring it into your garage. This is why you gotta clean stuff right before you install stuff. Look at that big old speck right there. That could cause some serious damage when the engine is running. So to clean all the main caps where all the bearings are gonna go, I'm gonna use some brake clean. That way it's gonna dry really quickly. It doesn't have any moisture in it. It's gonna get rid of all the moisture so that it won't rust or anything. And then we can set the bearings in there and then start installing the crankshaft. That's a cleaned block straight from the machine shop, and it still has that much dirt on it. It is super important to clean everything no matter how clean it already looks. You basically just want to keep cleaning until you don't see any more black spots. So even those lint-free towels are leaving tiny little fibers behind. Not sure if you can see it, but there's some tiny little fibers right there, just down here under the bearing. And so I'm going to try using a microfiber. That way if anything does come off of this one, I can at least see a big yellow spot. We'll give that a try. Damn, I think that is working better. All right, so we're gonna start cleaning the block to get it ready to install the crankshaft. What I did was just took off all the main caps. I'm gonna start by cleaning the block side of where all the bearings go. Then I'll start putting all the bearings in. And then I'm gonna clean the main caps individually, blow everything off with air, blow the whole block off with air, blow out all the oil holes, make sure that everything is spotless before I start reassembling. Then we're gonna clean our crankshaft, and then we can check the bearing clearances, and then finally put the crankshaft into the block. So to start, you just want to get some, I'm just putting some brake clean on a microfiber towel. You want to go through this process several times of just wiping every surface, blowing it off with air, wiping it again, blowing it off with air, checking for debris, and you really can't make this thing too clean. What you're going for is for it to be perfectly clean when you're done wiping it. But this towel is from cleaning just this block. This is a brand new microfiber towel when I started, and this is how much dirt will come off of it. So if you're not sure that it's clean, clean it 3 more times. All right, now that I have all the caps and the part of the block clean where all the bearings are gonna go, I'm gonna install the bearings just to keep everything that is already cleaned clean. And then we'll make sure that the bearings are super clean once we're starting to reassemble the block too. Okay, number 1 rule of any kind of bearings, you cannot touch them with your bare hands. There are oils on your fingers, and if the oils get on the bearing, it's gonna cause a spot where oil will not stick to the bearing, and it's gonna create a hot spot, and it's gonna wash out that bearing. So you can either wear gloves, or you can put a light film of engine oil on your fingers, and then you can handle the bearings that way. I just think it's better to use gloves because I don't want to get any oil on the back side of my bearings. So half of the bearings don't have holes in them, and half of them do. The part that goes into the block does have holes in them, which allows the oil to come up through the block and lube the crankshaft. You should always thoroughly inspect your bearings right out of the package. There have been many times where a bearing gets scratched during the packaging process, or they may even scratch themselves inside of this packaging just while you're carrying them around. And so when you take out every single bearing, you want to inspect it very closely and make sure that they've not been scratched or scored, because it's going to create a loose spot in the bearing right there. That's what a bearing should look like. So you can see the stamping on the bearing here. It shows 0.010 of an inch. That basically means that the crankshaft was ground 0.010 of an inch under. So you need to get oversized bearings that are thicker to make up for the difference. When you're installing the bearings, the tang on the bearing matches up with the tangs on the blocks. Basically just locks the bearing in so it doesn't spin. You just go ahead and set it down in there. And then just push the bearing down on both sides. Make sure it goes in evenly. And then you can actually look to see if it's flush. Make sure that both sides are completely flush. On to the next. Got all the bearings installed there. Now we can just put them in the caps. Once you have all your main caps on, give them a nice tap with the hammer to ensure that they're flush with the block. Then you can go ahead and torque the caps down. Torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna deep clean the crankshaft, make sure that it is super clean and ready to go into the engine. And then we can check all of our bearing clearances, and then we'll be able to install the crank. All right, this isn't completely necessary, but I don't have a solvent tank, so if you need to clean your crankshaft, you do what you gotta do. I'm using my shower. I got a bucket of soapy water, just some Dawn dish soap. It's gonna degrease everything off this crankshaft. And then you're gonna wanna get some of these rifle brushes so you can scrub out all the oil holes and make sure that there's no grime or metal shavings or grit or anything like that left inside of those holes. A little bit of lint on a crankshaft is okay. A little bit of fibers from a paper towel, microfiber towel is okay. But if you have any kind of metal shavings or grit or dirt in any of these oil holes and they make their way under the bearing, it can completely ruin your engine. So this is how I'm cleaning my crankshaft. You can get creative with it, but I just have some hot soapy water. I'm just gonna go ahead and clean all the grit off of every single one of these journals. So it's pretty obvious that you want to clean all the main journals and the pins for the connecting rods, but 2 other key areas that you want to get really clean are these counterweights. They do carry a lot of dirt and grime with them from the machine shop. And then the other spot is going to be inside of these oil holes. You want to scrub those out with a rifle brush. The part that's going to hold the very most dirt and it's going to be the most deceiving is going to be these oil holes right here. These have to be super clean. So take one of these rifle brushes and just run it down in there and just scrub this out. See how much dirt came off that? That was a brand new brush before I just did that, and it's already got black all over it. So little pieces of dirt and grime that work their way onto the bearings are gonna ruin your engine. Once you're done taking a bath, get some WD-40 in a rag and just go over all of the main journals very, very thoroughly. You're gonna notice after you clean this thing with soapy water, you're gonna start building up a lot of surface rust like on this bearing here. And you just wanna go over that with some WD-40. Get the counterweights too, just make sure that there's no spots for rust or anything. And good as new, brand new journal. All right, there's two ways to measure your bearing clearances. I'm gonna use the preferred method using a micrometer, but you can also use Plastigauge, and I'll show you how to use either one of them depending on which way you go. This micrometer is only 50 bucks. I recommend just doing it this way. It's a lot more precise. I'm just gonna go ahead and measure the main journals after they're super, super clean. And the only risk that you take doing this with the micrometer is scratching these bearings. So you just want to be super careful not to scratch anything. Just measure that a few times just to double check. 43 thousandths of an inch. And then we're going to come over here to our main bearing. And this is where you want to be really careful not to score it or scratch it as well. Going to stick it in the bore there. And just measure the size. Just want to find the biggest part of the bearing that you can. And then all you have to do is compare the measurement from the bearing size, the bearing bore, to the journal on the crankshaft, and then you just make the difference of it. So we have about 3 thousandths of an inch clearance. All right, I'm going to show you how to check your bearing clearances using Plastigauge. So we're going to install the crankshaft. So first we'll just put some assembly lube in the bearings. You really don't want too much. You don't have to like gum up those oil holes with it. Just get a good, nice film. Hold your breath while you do this. It's like Operation Shrek. Give it a little rotation. So you're just gonna break off a little piece of this super brittle stuff. Lay it on the bearing vertically like that. You go ahead and reinstall your main cap. Torque your crankshaft down. Bring it on 3 equal steps. First to 20, starting at the main cap, working outwards in a cross pattern. To 60. And 80. Now you untorque the cap. And then you see that little mark there that it left. It's on the inside of the bearing there too. You're just gonna take the green Plastigauge, the clearance range is gonna be in between 3 and 1/1000th of an inch. Anything smaller than that 1/1000th of an inch, so it's gonna squish it out bigger than that big mark, is way too tight. And anything over that 3/1000th mark is way too loose. Depending on your application, you're gonna want to do some research, talk to your machine shop, talk to your engine builder, figure out what the clearance is going to be right for you, because depending on how high you rev the engine, how much power you're going to be putting through this thing, what kind of oil pump you have, if you have a high volume, high pressure, low pressure, all of those factors matter when it comes to clearance. So if you're going to run a higher clearance, you're going to need more volume to make up for that. And pressure doesn't make up for bigger clearance. You have to have a high volume pump if you're going to run bigger clearances and a higher RPM. For this build, we're only going to be revving it to 6,500 to 7,000, somewhere in that range. That's what this bottom end can handle because of the weight of the pistons and the weight of the rods and the strength of the rods. And so in that range of revving between 6,500 to 7,000 RPM, we're going to want something within this range on the plastic gauge, preferably something around 25 thousandths of an inch, somewhere around there. So let's see what we got here. Looks like we have about 2 thousandths. That mark doesn't quite fit in the 3 thousandths mark, but it does fit in the 2 thousandths mark. So we have somewhere between 2 and 3 thousandths of an inch. That's going to be perfect for our build. And then all you want to do is just remove this plastic gauge on here. It just kind of rubs off. Just wipe that off. Definitely want these main journals to be super clean when you install the main caps. Anything that you can feel with your fingernail or see with a magnifying glass is going to be too much of an imperfection, and it will cause a tight crank. Clean off the cap too. Plastic gauge is a great method for checking your bearing clearances because it's super safe. You don't run the risk of scratching any of your main journals or your bearings. Whereas with a micrometer, it's possible that the sharp edges on the mic can scratch the bearing. So you'll actually see here on this bearing, those teeny little scratches there. If you didn't have this coating on your bearing, it's actually possible that you're not going to get as much oil flow. It's not going to be an even film of oil throughout the whole bearing, and you could actually end up washing out the bearing. But I can't even feel these with my fingernail. They're very, very smooth, and this coating is actually going to wipe off after about 20 minutes of the engine running. And so that's going to be okay, but it is possible to scratch your bearings, and it's a risk that you take using a micrometer. Now I know I just touched this with my bare hands, but I'm going to clean it. So make sure you don't touch these bearings with your bare hands and then install them onto the engine. All right, once you check the clearance on the bearing, go ahead and put some assembly lube on them. And start reinstalling all your caps. Repeat this for every main cap. Ensure you have the correct orientation and location of the cap. Slide it on. Give it a few light taps with a hammer. Just make sure it's seated all the way down. And then ARP recommends using this fastener assembly lube. Basically just make sure that you have an even torque on all the bolts. Just get a little bit of lube under where the washers go. A little bit of lube up the threads, and then install your washers. When you install your thrust bearings, make sure you get some assembly lube on the thrust surfaces on this edge here on both sides, and on the top bearing too. The reason why the thrust bearing is there and it has those two surfaces on the sides is so that the crankshaft can actually move forward and back on acceleration and deceleration. It's actually going to move forward and back, and those bearing surfaces are there on the thrust bearing to protect the crankshaft from moving too far and from smashing into the main caps here. But there is supposed to be a little bit of clearance there. It can't be too tight, can't be too loose. Once you've checked all the bearing clearances and you have all the caps on, assembly lube is inside of them, go ahead and torque down the bolts. All right, when you go to torque your crankshaft, there's a key step that no one ever seems to talk about. A little secret that I'm going to share with you. So as normal, you would go through your torque sequence starting going in 3 stages to 80 foot-pounds. So right now I'm doing 20 foot-pounds, going in a cross pattern starting from the middle of the crankshaft, working my way towards the outside of the crankshaft. Now the key step here is when you do your second pass and your third pass to torque the crankshaft, don't torque the thrust cap just yet. We have to set that cap in the center, otherwise our thrust clearance is going to be off, it's not going to be correct, and our crank's going to be too tight. So I'm gonna go ahead and torque all the rest of the bolts except for that main cap to those last 2 steps. Now you want to make sure the thrust cap is tight, just not too tight. I only torqued that one to 20 foot-pounds with the rest of them on my first pass. Then I did the rest of them to 60 foot-pounds and the rest of them to 80 foot-pounds, leaving that thrust cap a little bit loose. And then what you do is you take a big hammer. I'm going to smack the crank toward the back, smack the crank toward the front, and it's going to center this cap. It's going to lock down into its center place. That way we can achieve our proper thrust clearance. So you can just hit one of these counterweights here. Forwards and backwards, just like that. And now our thrust cap should be centered. Go ahead and torque it the rest of the way in 2 equal passes. I'm gonna go to 60 and then to 80. I'm just gonna go ahead and check all the rest of them just to be safe. Just make sure that they all got tightened. I didn't lose or forget any of them. Now I'll show you how to check your thrust clearance to make sure that that cap got centered correctly. So what you do is you pry your crankshaft all the way to the back of the engine as far as it will go. Set up your dial indicator on the front of the crankshaft and then calibrate it to 0. Now we're just going to pry the crankshaft forwards and see what we got. Looks like we've got about 3 to 4 thousandths of an inch, if you can see that. We almost got about 5 thousandths of an inch clearance. Might be a little bit hard to see, but that's really good. Anywhere between like 1 to 7 thousandths of an inch is okay. 7 thousandths is on the loose side, but it's still passable. All right, now that our crankshaft is installed, we're just gonna give it a turn and we're gonna check for any binding or tight spots. I mean, this thing should rotate really smoothly.